Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am Cheriel Brown and I am the owner of Third Person Omniscient Productions. I have this YouTube channel so that I can help new screenwriters with different concepts of screenwriting, different elements of screenwriting, such as how to write an impactful, wonderful scene. And I like to either talk about the elements of screenwriting, or I either like to talk about how movies help us make our lives better. So today I'm actually going to talk about one of the elements of screenwriting, as I mentioned, how to write a wonderful, impactful scene. I took a screenwriting course a long time ago, back when I was in college, with Gregory Allen Howard, who is the screenwriter for the movie Remember the Titans, and he was also one of the co-writers for the movie Harriet. And one of the things that Gregory Allen Howard drove in during that course was basically to have a movie that grosses $100 million or more, you have to have at least 4 great scenes within the script. So if you have less than 4 great scenes, 9 times out of 10, it's not going to be a top grossing box office hit. And as I mentioned in my last video when I was talking about the movie Honey Boy, and I talked about the chicken motif in that script, I brought out how well written the script actually is, and what I wanted to do in some subsequent videos was to go into more detail and more depth and talk about the different scenes and how they meet the criteria of an awesome scene. So the scene that I want to talk about today is the scene in Honey Boy between James, the father of the character Otis, and Tom, the man that is Otis's big brother from the Big Brother program. So in the scene, for a scene to be great, first of all, you have to meet certain criteria. So it has to have an objective, the scene has to have conflict, the scene should have subtext, the scene should also have setups and payoffs, and also the scene should have an arc. And if the scene has all of those things plus advances the story, then you get the overall effect and desire that you have in writing the scene, which is entertainment value. So let's look at that scene between James and Tom in the movie Honey Boy, and let's talk about the different elements of a scene, of a great scene that this scene actually has. So let's start off with the objective. In this particular scene, the objective for the character James, a lot of times when you're writing the scene, all of the characters in the scene have an objective, but just to make this teaching point, I'm only going to focus on the objective from James, because between James and Tom, James is the main character in this scene. So from the objective of James, it is to basically find out who Tom is, who is mentoring his son, and I don't use quotation marks in a bad way. He actually was his mentor, but I say mentor because he was the big brother in the Big Brother program. And so James wanted to kind of find out who this guy is, who's been spending all this time with his son, and that is the objective that James has in this scene, just to kind of see what, you know, just how much of an influence Tom is actually having over Otis. And so the second aspect of a great scene, I'm going to combine the two in this video for this particular scene, is conflict and subtext. And the reason why I'm combining these two elements together is because in this particular scene, the complex and the subtext are kind of intertwined, because the conflict in the scene is also the subtext that James is extremely jealous of Tom. He's extremely jealous that Tom seems to have his life together, is spending all this time with his 12-year-old son Otis, and seems to have more influence, more of a powerful influence than, not powerful, more of a positive influence and impact over Otis than perhaps James is having. So that's the conflict in the scene, but it's also buried in the subtext as well, this jealousy that James feels. So that's the second and third element of a great scene. So now let's move on to the fourth one, which is setups and payoffs. With setups and payoffs, you will bring something up earlier in the, either earlier in the movie or earlier in that particular scene, and then you pay it off throughout the course of that scene. Or if it's something that's brought up earlier in the movie, it might be paid off later on in the movie. But for this particular scene, the setups are In an earlier scene, Otis tells Tom, you know, when you go spend time with my dad, don't bring up the Big Brother program. It's going to really like piss him off. And then that's an earlier setup from a previous scene prior to the actual scene. And then within the scene, the setup is when James asks Tom if he can take his coat, because he's invited him over to have a little barbecue with him and Otis. And he's like, can I take your coat? So I'm going to move on to scene arc next, because it'll tell you what the payoffs were from those two prior setups. So with the scene arc, you have to make sure that the scene has a distinct beginning, middle, and end. Okay? And that might sound obvious. And I used to think that when I was like in middle school, when the teacher would say, your story has to have a beginning, middle, and end. And I'd be like, duh. But the whole thing of what it means to have a beginning, middle, and end is that certain things are happening at the beginning, certain things are happening in the middle, and then certain things happen at the end. So in terms of the scene arc for this particular scene, the beginning of the scene is the part where we get a little bit of exposition. James is looking under the hood of Tom's truck, a Ford. He's admiring the engine. He's, you know, like just casually asking Tom some questions about his life. This is just basically, it's the beginning, because it gives us information about what's going to be happening in the scene. It gives us information about the characters. That's the beginning. The middle of the scene is the conflict that happens within the scene. So as this scene progresses, the conflict, you know, shows up as the festering jealousy that James has that's boiling underneath everything that they're saying and talking about. And then the end of this scene is when James like forces Tom to take his jacket off, and in the process throws him into the pool. So that's also a payoff from the earlier setups, because the thing that started to piss James off and to get him angry enough to throw him into the pool was when Tom brought up the Big Brother program and how, you know, he has the goal of providing some type of support and influence for Otis. The setup was earlier when Otis told him, don't bring up the Big Brother program. The payoff is when Tom brings it up. It pisses James off so much. And then, you know, another setup was James asking Tom if he wanted to take his coat off, and Tom said no. And once he gets pissed off about the Big Brother program, he kind of forces Tom to take his coat off and then throws him into the pool. So within the matter of like 45 seconds, we get both of the payoffs to two earlier setups. So that's the scene arc for this scene. It's the beginning, finding out some information about Tom, the middle, the festering jealousy that James has that's building and building and building, which is also creating tension, and then the end of the scene when Tom gets thrown into the pool. So after we examine the scene arc, the next thing that's left is to basically acknowledge that all of these things are advancing the story. Because when James throws Tom into the pool, he tells him, I don't ever want to see you around my son again. So this is kind of like, you know, this is the end of, you know, Otis being a part of the Big Brother program. There's another scene later on where James kind of brings up the Big Brother program to Otis's mother, but I can talk about that in another video, because I'm going to talk about different scenes that are also in the movie. So since everything advances the story, then we get the overall goal of what a scene is for entertainment value. So because this scene has an objective, this scene has conflict and subtext, the scene has setups and payoffs, the scene has a scene arc, and it advances the story, because all of those things exist within the scene, we get the very thing that you want when you're writing a scene, which is entertainment. So I'm going to end the video here. I just like to point out these aspects of screenwriting. You can use that with any scene that you're writing in your script right now. Make sure it has those following things. Make sure it has, again, objective, conflict, subtext, setups and payoffs, a scene arc. Make sure that it advances the story, and then if you do all of those things, you'll have the entertainment value that you're looking for. Remember, your script has to have at least 4 amazing, outstanding scenes. At least for it to be a good movie. There are other movies that every scene is extremely, exceptionally well written, like in Straight Outta Compton, for example, but I can do that in another video. But just remember to include those seven, at least those seven aspects within your scene. And again, when you have conflict, you are creating tension. We can talk about that in another video. But until then, I want you guys to have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining me. Make sure that you like this video if it was helpful to you. Share it out with your friends, and make sure you don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much, and I will see you guys next time.